It was an evening that wasn't supposed to be memorable. An ordinary, unremarkable evening at a suburban movie theater where the scent of popcorn mixed with the aroma of cheap carpeting and the whispers of strangers' conversations. But something felt wrong from the start, like a thin electric charge vibrating in the air. Amanda Rosewood nervously adjusted her hair, standing at the ticket counter. Beside her, her daughter Madison excitedly told something to Liam, her new boyfriend. Amanda tried not to listen. Liam, tall, confident, with an easy, carefree smile, was one of those people who naturally drew attention just by being present. He seemed too grown up for her 20-year-old daughter, too sure of himself, but she hesitated to voice these thoughts. "Are you coming with us, Mom?" Madison asked, turning to her with the same easy smile she inherited from her father. Amanda nodded, although something inside her protested. She was about to decline, make up an excuse, but Madison had already handed her a ticket. When they entered the dimly lit theater, it turned out their seats were scattered. Madison lingered at the popcorn stand, leaving Amanda and Liam to choose seats on their own. Instinctively, she tried to pick a seat at the end of the row, far from him, but Liam had already taken a seat in the center. "Sit here," he said, patting the seat next to him. She hesitated, feeling his gaze burning into her. Then she quickly sat down, convincing herself it was just a movie. Just a couple of hours she could easily get through. But a few minutes later, everything changed. Someone mistakenly sat in her seat, and Liam, not having time to negotiate, looked up at Amanda with a slight smirk. "Sit here," he said, patting his lap. She froze. Her heart began to race faster than it should have. This had to be a joke, right? It must be. She met his gaze, hoping to see a hint of humor, but there was something else in his eyes, warm and unsettling at the same time. "Come on, no one will notice," he added softly, lowering his voice. Amanda felt a wave of heat wash over her, as if the entire theater had suddenly been enveloped in thick, sultry air. It was just a moment, fleeting, meaningless, and yet, as she carefully lowered herself onto his lap, she knew she had crossed some invisible line. The movie started, but she saw nothing. His hands, casually resting on her thighs, felt like molten metal searing through the thin fabric of her dress. Her breathing became uneven, and she hated how her body responded. When Madison finally made her way down the aisle, giggling about something, Amanda quickly stood up, nearly knocking over the popcorn. "Is everything okay?" Madison asked, sitting down next to her. "Yes, everything's fine," Amanda quickly replied, turning away. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Liam giving her a brief glance. In that look was everything she feared: understanding, challenge, and worst of all, a promise. It seemed like nothing had happened, but Amanda knew. Something had already broken. Amanda woke up early. The day promised to be hot, even though a lazy fog still lingered over the streets. She turned on the coffee maker, filling the kitchen with a familiar aroma. This was her morning ritual, a quiet, soothing start to a new day. But today, something was different. She couldn't get last night out of her head. His gaze, the touch of his hands, the lingering sense of his presence. She dismissed it all as exhaustion, anything but the truth that it was real. Amanda took a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was slowly breaking through the thick blanket of clouds, illuminating the well-tended flower beds and the cracked tiles of the terrace. She stared at the cup in her hands, hoping the hot drink would dispel her troubling thoughts. But her thoughts kept returning to that moment in the theater. She remembered not just his touches, but the warmth of his body, his scent. She hated herself for it. "This is Liam, your daughter's boyfriend," she kept telling herself. And yet, the silence was broken by the sound of the door opening. She turned and saw Liam standing in the kitchen doorway. He was wearing dark jeans and a t-shirt that hugged his athletic frame. His hair was still damp from the shower, and he held a mug as if he belonged there. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft but deep. He took a few steps out onto the terrace. "Morning," she managed to say, turning away and pretending to be more interested in the jasmine bush than in him. "Madison is still asleep," he said, standing next to her. She could feel his closeness, the warmth radiating from him. "She got in late," Amanda replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Liam took a sip of his coffee and casually leaned against the railing next to her. His movement was slow, relaxed, as if he belonged there. "You look tense," he said, not looking at her, but his words hit her, as if he knew what was going on inside her. I'm fine, she lied, taking another sip of her coffee. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid he could hear it. Liam was silent. His silence was more oppressive than any words. Amanda couldn't take it anymore and turned to him, ready to say something, anything to break the silence. But he was already looking at her. His gaze was the same as it had been the night before in the theater. That look seemed to see right through her, exposing every weakness. Liam, she began, not knowing what to say. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, he said. His voice sounded sincere, but there was an elusive note of confidence in it that irritated her. I don't feel uncomfortable, she replied too quickly, only confirming the opposite. He gave a slight smile, taking another sip of his coffee. Good, he said simply. And then he added, You deserve to be noticed. Those words hit their mark. She didn't know why they affected her so much, but she felt her cheeks flush. She turned away, focusing on the mug in her hands. Liam just stood there, and despite the lightness of his tone, Amanda felt the atmosphere between them filling with something that made her want to run. But she couldn't leave. She stayed there on the terrace while they both remained silent, sharing the same space. A light breeze ruffled her hair, and his hand accidentally brushed against hers as he turned to go inside. It was accidental. It had to be accidental. But Amanda knew it had crossed a line again. Thin, almost imperceptible, but so important. Amanda tried not to think about her morning conversation with Liam, but by lunchtime, memories of his words, his closeness on the terrace, had seeped into her thoughts like water through a crack in a dam. You deserve to be noticed. Those words echoed in her head, making her wonder how long she had been invisible in her own home. All day she was busy, meetings with clients, discussing a new contract, preparing reports. But even in the bustle of office tasks, she found herself thinking about him. It shouldn't have meant anything. She was an adult. He was just a young guy, her daughter's boyfriend. But there was something about the way he looked at her, the way he spoke, that she couldn't shake off. When she returned home that evening, Madison was already out with a friend. Amanda heard the sound of water from the bathroom. Liam was still here. She went to the kitchen, threw her keys on the table, and started preparing dinner. Her hands moved mechanically, but her thoughts were racing. Good evening, his voice came from behind her. She turned and saw him. His hair was still wet, and he was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked casual, as if he belonged in this house. But that was what scared her. Evening, she replied curtly, turning back to the sink. Her heart started racing again. You look tired, he noted, stepping closer. She could feel him approaching, even though she wasn't looking at him. Long day, she muttered, hoping he wouldn't hear the tremor in her voice. He stopped next to her, his gaze burning into her skin. Amanda felt the tension in the air becoming almost palpable. She put the knife down on the cutting board and forced herself to turn around. Want some coffee? She asked, trying to sound casual. No, he replied, smiling at the corners of his mouth, but thank you. She noticed his eyes lingering on her face a moment longer than they should have. Then he raised his hand, lightly touching her forearm. It was fleeting, but she felt a shiver run through her body. Can I help with dinner? He offered, not moving his hand. No, she quickly replied, taking a step back. Her voice came out louder than she expected. Liam looked at her, squinting his eyes as if trying to read her thoughts. Am I making you nervous? He asked softly. Her breath caught. No, of course not, she said, too quickly, too sharply. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening but still insistent. If this is about last night, you know I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke. A joke, she repeated, forcing herself to smile. Of course. But there was more to his words. She knew it, felt it. The way he looked at her was too intense, too attentive. She wanted to end this conversation, leave the room, but instead, she froze like a trapped animal. Amanda, he said her name slowly, as if savoring it. His voice grew lower, softer. You know I can't stop thinking about you. Her heart stopped. These were the words she feared, but deep down, expected. She looked at him, her lips parted, but no sound came out. Liam, she began, but her voice was weak, barely audible. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Now he was standing so close that she could feel the warmth of his body, smell his skin. His eyes, deep and piercing, searched hers. "I know this is wrong," he said softly, "but you feel the same way, don't you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Words stuck in her throat. Her mind screamed to stop, to leave, but her body wouldn't listen. Her gaze flicked between his eyes and his lips, and she felt her fingers trembling. He raised his hand, gently touching her cheek. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, everything stood still. Just the two of them in this quiet, cozy kitchen, where everything suddenly felt so dangerous. "I can't," she whispered, barely audible. But she didn't move. She didn't pull away. And when his lips softly touched hers, the world around them seemed to dissolve. It was a moment she had tried to avoid but couldn't stop longing for. And in that moment, she knew the line had been crossed. The night was warm, but the house was unusually quiet. The clock on the wall ticked with an almost aggressive insistence, filling the emptiness that felt oppressive. Amanda sat in a chair in the living room, clutching a glass of wine. Her gaze was fixed on the TV screen, but she saw no images and heard no sound. Her thoughts were elsewhere, returning to the moment that had happened a few hours earlier. She tried to convince herself it was just an impulse, a mistake that wouldn't happen again. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, his eyes full of desire and desperation, his hands which carefully touched her, as if afraid to shatter the fragile moment. And the worst part, she felt like she wanted it again. Her phone vibrated, pulling her out of her thoughts. Amanda picked it up and looked at the screen. The message was from Liam. 3 simple words. "Thinking of you." She sat up straight, feeling her heart start to race. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she looked at the text, not knowing how to respond. 2 voices echoed in her head, one screaming to end it all, that this would ruin her life, and the other whispering that she deserved to feel alive, if only for a moment. Amanda typed a response but deleted it, then started typing again. Her hands were shaking, and she threw the phone on the table as if it were red hot. She got up and headed to the kitchen, where she put the glass on the counter and gripped the edge, trying to steady her breath. But everything changed when she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at the clock. It was already past midnight. Who could be coming at this hour? She walked to the door, trying not to make a sound, and cautiously peeked through the peephole. It was him. Amanda froze, not believing her eyes. Liam stood on the porch, his hands in his pockets, a hesitant smile on his face. He looked like he wasn't sure why he was there himself. She wanted to leave him there, just turn around and pretend he wasn't there, but her feet were already moving on their own. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice sharp but trembling. "Couldn't stop thinking about you," he replied. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "I know this is wrong, but I just had to see you." She glanced over her shoulder, making sure Madison wasn't back. Assured the house was empty, Amanda turned back to him. "You can't be here," she said, but there was no strength in her words. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His gaze was insistent, burning. "I know," he said, his voice softer. "But do you want me to leave?" Amanda couldn't answer. She wanted to say yes, wanted to close the door and end this dangerous game. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she stepped back, allowing him to enter. When the door closed, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air became heavy, the tension building with each passing moment. Liam stood before her, his face serious but gentle. He raised his hand and gently touched her cheek. "Amanda," he said, his voice a whisper, "I know what you're feeling. It's not just me." Her breath hitched as he moved closer. Her mind screamed that this was wrong, that it all had to stop, but his touch made her forget everything. His fingers slid down her cheek, then her neck, sending a shiver she couldn't hide. "This is madness," she whispered, barely breathing. "But you don't want me to stop," he replied. And he was right. She knew this would ruin her life, that every next step would lead to disaster, but she couldn't stop herself. She closed her eyes, and at that moment, his lips gently touched hers. The kiss was cautious, almost reverent, as if he was afraid she would push him away. But she didn't push him away. Her hands rose, wrapping around his neck, and everything she had held back for so long burst forth. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer. It was a moment they both had waited for too long. In the room there was only them, their breath, their touch, their desire. But reality soon reminded them of itself. Amanda pulled away, her eyes wide open. "This is wrong," she said, her voice trembling. We can't." "But we already have," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. She said nothing, just looked at him, trying to figure out what to do. She felt the cracks beginning to form in her carefully constructed life. But despite that, she knew she couldn't turn back. Liam looked at her, his eyes filled with emotions he couldn't hide. "I'm not asking you to decide anything now," he said. I want you to know that you matter to me." Those words hit her harder than any kiss. She turned away, feeling tears fill her eyes. This was madness, a complete catastrophe. But despite that, she knew she couldn't stop what had already begun. The next morning, Amanda woke up earlier than usual. Her head was heavy from lack of sleep, her thoughts tangled like a thick fog. She spent the night tossing and turning, each time remembering Liam's gaze, his words, his touch. Her inner voice desperately tried to convince her that she could just forget it all, but she knew it was too late. In the kitchen, Liam was already there. He stood by the coffee maker, pouring himself a cup. Seeing Amanda, he turned, and his face lit up with a soft smile that seemed so natural it made her, for a moment, feel as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. She froze, feeling his fingers lightly brush against her hand. It was almost imperceptible, but it stirred the same emotions she had been trying to suppress. "Morning," she replied, trying not to look him in the eye. The silence between them was tense but not uncomfortable. She sat at the kitchen table, pretending to be focused on the newspaper Madison had probably left behind. Liam sat across from her, holding his cup with both hands. His gaze never left her. "You're avoiding me," he noted, his voice soft but direct. Amanda looked up. His directness caught her off guard. She tried to come up with an excuse but ended up saying the truth. "I'm trying to figure out what to do with this." Liam nodded, as if he had expected such an answer. He took a sip of his coffee and leaned back, his face calm but his eyes tense. "I know it's complicated," he said, "but this is not something I can just ignore." She wanted to argue, to say they both needed to stop this, but she couldn't. Instead, she looked away, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the cup. At that moment, Madison appeared in the kitchen, dressed in her workout clothes with a towel over her shoulder. Her hair was casually tied in a bun, and there was a light smile on her face. "You're both up early," she said, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. Amanda felt her heart skip a beat. She tried to maintain her composure, acting as if everything was normal, but she felt like the tension between her and Liam was palpable in the air, like a storm cloud. "I just wanted to get some things done before my client meeting," Amanda replied, trying to keep her voice normal. Madison seemed not to notice anything. She sat down at the table and started talking about her plans for the day, mentioning workouts and an evening with friends. Liam nodded, asking questions, but his gaze occasionally flicked to Amanda. Those brief, fleeting glances were like sparks she tried to ignore. When Madison left, leaving them alone, the silence returned, but this time it was almost unbearable. Liam stood up, walked to the sink, and placed his cup, then turned to Amanda. "You know I'm right," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Amanda stood up, feeling her legs tremble. She headed for the door, but his hand gently grasped her wrist, firm but gentle. "Tell me you don't want this," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. Her breath hitched, and she felt her lips start to tremble. She wanted to say it, wanted to, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she pulled her hand away and left the kitchen, leaving him standing there alone. The day dragged on painfully. Amanda tried to focus on work, but her thoughts kept returning to the morning, to his words, his closeness. It all felt like a slowly tightening noose from which there was no escape. When she returned home, the house was quiet. Madison was still with her friends, and surprisingly, Liam was not there. This gave her a reprieve, but also a strange sense of emptiness. She sat on the couch, hugging her knees, and stared at the turned-off TV. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Liam, this time longer than in the morning. I know this is hard for both of us, but I can't ignore it. You matter to me, Amanda. Tell me you feel the same. She looked at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her mind battled with her heart, but like in the morning, she couldn't send a reply. She put the phone on the table, turned off the sound, and closed her eyes. But the inner voice whispered to her, "This is just the beginning." Sunday began unusually quiet. The house lacked the familiar noise. Madison's voice talking about her plans for the day. The sun lazily filtered through the curtains, filling the living room with soft light. But Amanda felt a chill inside. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, staring at her phone. Liam's message from the previous night remained unread. She was avoiding him as best she could, trying to regain control of her life. But the truth was clear. Control was lost. There was a knock at the door, making her jump. Amanda froze, then slowly stood up and walked to the door. She knew who it was. Her heart slowed, as if her body was bracing for impact. She opened the door. Standing on the porch was Liam, dressed simply in jeans, a t-shirt, and a leather jacket. His face was tense, but his eyes, as always, were piercing. They met each other's gaze, and she felt a spark pass between them. "We need to talk," he said calmly but firmly. Amanda sighed and opened the door wider, allowing him to enter. She closed it behind him, but didn't turn around, afraid to see his face. "Liam, I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice weak. This has gone too far." He stepped closer, his footsteps soft but confident. "Do you really think so?" he asked, his voice low with a hint of disappointment. She turned to face him. "Yes," she said, looking him in the eye. "You need to focus on Madison. I'm her mother. Everything that's happening between us is a mistake." He took a step closer, his face serious. "This isn't a mistake, Amanda. You know that as well as I do." She took a breath. She knew there was nothing she could say in response. He was right. But the truth wasn't enough. Everything they had built, or destroyed, hung by threads that were about to snap. "It doesn't matter anymore," she replied. "I can't lose my daughter. This has already ruined everything we had." Liam was silent. His face expressed a pain he was trying to hide. "And what about us?" he asked. "Are you saying that means nothing?" She looked away, her fingers nervously clenching. "It means too much," she whispered, "and that's why I have to end this." By the time Madison returned home, Liam was already gone. Amanda sat on the couch, feeling drained, as if she had been wrung out like a lemon. Her daughter, cheerful and unsuspecting, talked about how fun her day had been. Amanda smiled, nodded, but each word from her daughter echoed in her soul with pain. She had already made the decision that would change everything. Later that evening, when Madison went up to her room, Amanda quietly entered the kitchen and found her phone. She opened the chat with Liam. Her fingers hesitated on the keyboard, but she typed a short message. "We can't see each other anymore. This is the end. Please don't write or call." She hit send, closing her eyes as if that could relieve the weight of what was happening. A few seconds later, the phone vibrated. The response was short but to the point. "I understand." The following days were painfully quiet. Liam never showed up again. His things, which he sometimes left in the house, disappeared as if he had never been there. Amanda noticed that this had no effect on Madison. She continued to see him, suspecting nothing. Amanda, on the other hand, watched this from the sidelines, feeling her heart break every time she saw his face. But the worst moment came a week later. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Madison suddenly looked up at Amanda. Her face expressed confusion and concern. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked. Amanda blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, everything's fine," she quickly replied. Madison frowned. "You look different. Lately, I can't figure out what's wrong." Amanda lowered her gaze, trying not to give herself away. "I'm just tired, sweetheart. Work has been tough." Madison nodded, but her gaze remained focused, as if she was still searching for an answer. Amanda felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to tell her everything, lay out the truth, but she knew it would never be enough. Madison shouldn't know. When dinner was over, Amanda returned to her bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed staring out the window. Beyond it lay the starry sky, calm and distant, like her life that she could no longer control. The last time she saw Liam was a month later. He came to pick up Madison, but lingered briefly at the door when their eyes met. His face was calm, but in his eyes she saw it all. The pain, the regret, the feelings he could no longer express. He nodded to her in farewell before leaving the house with her daughter. And that was it. Amanda never saw him again, but the shadows of what had been between them stayed with her. Sometimes, sitting alone, she would remember his gaze, his touch. She knew she had done the right thing, but the right decisions rarely bring peace. She lived on as best she could. She rebuilt her relationship with Madison, focused on her work, on her fragile plans. But in her heart, there remained a void she could never fill.